Picture this. A boy stands in a stone courtyard, bare feet cold against the morning frost. He's 9 years old. Around him, servants move in silence, loading mules with carpets and silver plate, the last valuables of a house being emptied. His mother weeps somewhere inside the keep, the sound muffled by thick walls, but he can hear it. He has heard it for 3 days now. His father kneels, not in prayer, not in defeat, in transaction. Before him stand 2 Ottoman officers in silk robes, their horses stamping behind them, breath misting in the mountain air. One holds a scroll, the other holds a purse, heavy, clinking, the sound of gold pieces shifting against each other, the sound of a price being paid. The boy does not yet understand what is happening. He watches his father's hands, the same hands that taught him to hold a sword, that lifted him onto his first horse, that gripped his shoulder and called him the future of their house. Those hands now tremble as they accept the purse. The officers turn toward the boy. He feels it then, the cold that has nothing to do with frost, the understanding that floods through a child's body before words can form. He looks at his father. His father does not look back. The smell of horse sweat, the creak of leather saddles, the weight of a hand, not his father's, closing around his arm. "Come," says one of the officers, not unkindly. The way one speaks to livestock being led to market. The boy walks, his feet leave the courtyard, his eyes stay fixed on his father's back, the back that never turns, never rises from its kneel. He will remember this, for 30 years through blood and fire and triumph. He will remember his father's spine curved in submission, and he will build an empire of defiance upon that memory. His name is Gjergj Kastrioti. He is 9 years old. He has just been sold to pay for peace. The Ottomans have a system for boys like him. They call it devshirme, the blood tax. Christian families across the Balkans must surrender their sons to the Sultan's service. The boys are taken to Edirne, circumcised, converted to Islam, trained in Turkish language and Ottoman warfare. The strongest become janissaries, the Sultan's elite slave soldiers. The smartest become administrators, diplomats, executioners. The system is designed to accomplish one thing: erasure. The boy who enters Ottoman service must forget his name, his language, his god, his father's face. He must become a weapon pointed at his own people. Gjergj Kastrioti will become exactly what they design him to be, for 20 years. And then he will become something else entirely. Something the Ottomans have no system for, no protocol, no defence against. He will become Skanderbeg, a name that means Lord Alexander, given to him by the Sultan himself in admiration. And he will use everything the Ottomans taught him to burn their empire back from the borders of Europe. Historians still debate whether his father, Gjergj Kastrioti, had any choice in surrendering his son. The Ottomans had already crushed 2 Albanian rebellions. They had already taken Gjergj's older sons as hostages. The devshirme was not a request. It was a demand backed by the certainty of annihilation. To refuse was to watch your lands burn, your wife raped, your bloodline erased from history. Gjergj chose survival. He chose to kneel. His younger son would spend 3 decades ensuring that no Albanian lord would ever have to make that choice again. But that morning, in that courtyard, there was only a boy being led away. Only the sound of his mother's weeping fading behind him. Only the knowledge settling into his bones like ice, that his father had measured his value and found a number. How does a child survive that arithmetic? How does he grow into a man who trusts anyone? How does he learn to love a country that sold him? The answers lie in blood, in patience, in a betrayal so perfectly executed that it would take the Ottoman Empire 25 years and 23 invasions to recover from it. But first, the boy must become the weapon. First, he must forget everything he is. First, he must kneel. The journey to Edirne took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of mountain passes and river crossings, of sleeping in military camps surrounded by soldiers who spoke a language the boy did not understand. 6 weeks of watching the landscape change, the familiar Albanian peaks giving way to Macedonian plains, then the rolling hills of Thrace, then finally the minarets of the Ottoman capital rising against the eastern sky. Gjergj arrived with nothing. No possessions, no family, no name that mattered anymore. The devshirme system processed him with bureaucratic efficiency. His hair was cut, his clothes were burned. He was examined by physicians who noted his height, his teeth, his muscle development. He was assigned a number. He was given a new name, one he would learn to answer to, one that erased the syllables his mother had whispered over his cradle. The circumcision came on the third day. No ceremony, no explanation, just a room that smelled of copper and alcohol, a physician's blade, and pain that taught him his first Ottoman lesson: your body is not your own. The conversion followed. He learned to pray 5 times daily, facing Mecca. He learned the Shahada, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. And he learned to say it without flinching, without hesitation, without any flicker of the cross his mother had pressed into his palm the morning he was taken. Historians still debate whether Skanderbeg ever truly believed. Some say he remained secretly Christian throughout his Ottoman years, nursing his faith in private like an ember preserved for kindling. Others argue that belief is irrelevant, that he adapted with the perfect pragmatism of a survivor, wearing Islam the way a soldier wears armour, because it kept him alive. What is certain is this: he learned. The Ottoman military academies were the finest in the world. While European nobles learned warfare through hunting parties and jousting tournaments, Ottoman cadets studied logistics, engineering, siege warfare, cavalry tactics, and infantry discipline with scientific precision. They read military treatises in Arabic and Persian. They practiced with weapons until their hands bled, then practiced more. They were taught that defeat was unacceptable, that the Sultan's army had not lost a major battle in a century, that they were the instruments of God's will on earth. Gjergj excelled. Of course he excelled. Survival demanded nothing less. By 14 he could ride a horse at full gallop while loosing arrows with killing accuracy. By 16 he commanded a small cavalry unit in training exercises. By 18 he was fighting in real campaigns, suppressing rebellions in Anatolia, raiding Byzantine territories, learning the taste of blood in his mouth and the weight of a sword that has just ended a life. The Ottomans noticed him. How could they not? The Albanian boy fought with a fury that seemed personal, as if every enemy he killed had somehow wronged him specifically. His commanders praised his courage. His fellow soldiers respected his skill. The Sultan's court began to hear whispers of a young officer who seemed destined for greatness. They gave him the name Skanderbeg, Lord Alexander, after Alexander the Great. It was the highest compliment the Ottoman military could bestow. It meant they saw in him the ghost of history's greatest conqueror. He wore the name like a mask. Behind it, something watched, something remembered. The campaigns took him across 3 continents. He fought Persians in the east, Hungarians in the north, Venetians on the Adriatic coast. He learned how the Ottoman war machine functioned, not just its tactics, but its supply chains, its communication networks, its political fault lines. He learned which generals were competent and which were promoted through court favour. He learned where the empire was strong and where it was hollow. He learned, most importantly, how to lose. In 1443, the Hungarian general John Hunyadi launched a crusade into Ottoman territory. The campaign carved through Serbia and Bulgaria like a blade through silk. Ottoman armies that had seemed invincible crumbled before European heavy cavalry. The Sultan himself was forced to flee a battlefield, and humiliation that had not occurred in generations. Gjergj Kastrioti was there. He watched the Ottoman lines break. He watched disciplined Janissaries scatter like sheep before Hungarian knights. He watched an empire that had consumed his childhood revealed as something that could bleed, something that could fear, something that could be beaten. That night, in the chaos of retreat, he made his choice. He did not run toward the Hungarians. That would have been too obvious, too suspicious. Instead, he found an Ottoman secretary, a man who carried the Sultan's seal, who could forge documents that would open any door in the empire. What happened to that secretary has never been confirmed. His body was found 3 days later, throat cut, documents missing. Gjergj Kastrioti rode north through the darkness, carrying a forged letter commanding the Ottoman garrison at Kruja, his father's fortress, the home he had been taken from 20 years before, to surrender the citadel to its bearer. He was going home, and he was bringing everything the Ottomans had taught him with him. The ride from Niš to Kruja covered 400 miles of mountain terrain. Gjergj made it in 8 days, changing horses at Ottoman military posts, flashing his forged credentials at every checkpoint. The letter worked perfectly. Of course it did. He had spent 20 years learning exactly how Ottoman bureaucracy functioned, exactly which seals mattered. exactly how a commander's signature should look. Each post saluted him, each gate opened. Each mile brought him closer to a fortress he remembered only in fragments, the smell of pine smoke, the sound of his mother's voice echoing off stone walls, the view of the valley below where shepherds moved their flocks in patterns unchanged for centuries. He arrived at Kruja on November 28, 1443. The garrison commander read the forged letter, examined the Sultan's seal, and surrendered the fortress without question. That night, Gjergj Kastrioti climbed to the highest tower of his father's citadel. Below him spread the Albanian highlands, a landscape of impossible mountains and hidden valleys that had resisted every empire since Rome. Above him wheeled stars his mother had named for him 30 years before, in a language the Ottomans had tried to burn out of his throat. He was home. But home had changed. His father had died years ago, some said of shame, some said of relief, some said simply of age and accumulated griefs. His mother had followed soon after. His brothers, also taken in the Devshirme, had either died in Ottoman service or disappeared into the empire's vastness. The castle he remembered as a place of warmth and safety was now a military garrison staffed by men who had never heard his birth name. Historians still debate whether he felt anything that night. The sources are silent on his emotions, recording only his actions, which were swift, methodical, and utterly without sentiment. Within hours he had executed the Ottoman garrison. Every soldier, every administrator, every man who wore the Sultan's colours. The bodies were thrown from the walls left for the mountain wolves. Then he raised a flag. The double-headed eagle, ancient symbol of Albanian nobility, of Epirot kings, of a people who had been conquered but never quite absorbed. It had not flown over Kruja in a generation. Now it snapped in the mountain wind, visible for miles, announcing to every village and every Ottoman patrol that something had changed. The message was unmistakable. The Sultan's favourite Albanian had come home to make war. The next weeks moved with the precision of a military campaign, which of course is exactly what they were. Gjergj sent riders to every Albanian lord, every mountain chief, every clan leader who still remembered independence. His message was simple. I know how they fight. I know where they are weak. I know how to beat them. Join me or remain slaves. They came. Not all at once, not without suspicion, but they came. The Arianiti clan, who controlled the southern highlands, the Dukagjini, whose lands bordered Serbia, the Muzaka, the Thopia, the Zenovisi, families that had feuded for generations, that had betrayed each other more times than any chronicle could record. They came to Kruja, and they looked at this stranger who spoke their language with an Ottoman accent, who wore his beard in the Turkish style, who carried weapons forged in Edirne. They did not trust him. How could they? He had spent more years serving the Sultan than he had spent being Albanian. But they listened. Because the double-headed eagle flew over Kruja, because the bodies of Ottoman soldiers rotted in the valley below, because this man, whoever he truly was, had done something none of them had managed in 50 years. He had said no. In March 1444, the Albanian lords gathered at the Cathedral of Leisure for a council that would determine the fate of their nation. The meeting lasted 3 days. There were arguments about territory, about command, about whether this former Ottoman could be trusted. There were threats. At least 2 lords had to be physically separated after drawing knives. But in the end, they formed the League of Leisure, a military alliance against the Ottoman Empire with Gjergj Kastrioti as its supreme commander. They gave him a new title, Captain General of Albania. He accepted the honour with a speech that no chronicle records in full, but fragments survive. He reportedly told the assembled lords, I have not brought you liberty, I have brought you war. Liberty you must win yourselves. The Ottomans learned of the rebellion within weeks. Sultan Murad, fresh from his humiliation at the hands of the Hungarians, received the news with cold fury. The Albanian boy he had raised, trained, honoured with the name of Alexander, that boy had betrayed everything, had killed Ottoman soldiers, had raised a treasonous flag. The Sultan began assembling an army, not a punitive expedition, an army of extermination. Skanderbeg was ready. He had been ready for 20 years. The real war was about to begin. The first Ottoman army arrived in June 1444, 25,000 men under the command of Ali Pasha, a general whose reputation for brutality had pacified rebellions from the Danube to the Euphrates. His orders were explicit: recapture Kruja, execute the traitor Skanderbeg, and burn every Albanian village that had supported the rebellion. Ali Pasha expected a siege. The Albanian rebels would retreat behind Kruja's walls, he reasoned, and wait to be starved out like every other Balkan insurrection before them. Instead, Skanderbeg met him in the open. The valley of Torviol sits at the junction of two mountain passes, a natural choke point where the terrain narrows to barely half a mile wide. Skanderbeg had chosen it months in advance, had studied its sight lines and escape routes, had positioned his forces in the pine forests above the valley floor where Ottoman cavalry would be useless. He had perhaps 8,000 men, a third of Ali Pasha's force. What happened next would be repeated, with variations for the next 23 years. The Ottoman army entered the valley in standard march formation, cavalry in front, infantry behind, supply wagons trailing. Ali Pasha rode at the centre, confident in his numbers, dismissive of these mountain bandits who presumed to challenge the Sultan's authority. The first arrows came from the trees, not a volley, that would have been wasteful. Targeted shots, aimed at officers, at standard bearers, at the horses of the cavalry vanguard. The animals screamed and reared. Formations buckled. Soldiers looked up at the forested slopes and saw nothing, just shadows between the pines, just the whisper of bowstrings being drawn. Then the Albanians charged downhill. Skanderbeg had learned many things in Ottoman service, but the most important was this. Heavy cavalry wins battles on open ground, but in mountains mobility is everything. His fighters wore light armour or none at all. They carried short swords and javelins, weapons designed for close combat in broken terrain. They knew every rock, every gully, every path that a man could use to appear behind an enemy who thought he was surrounded. The battle lasted 4 hours. It should not have been a battle at all. It should have been a massacre of the outnumbered Albanians by professional Ottoman soldiers. Instead, it became something else. A lesson, a humiliation. Ali Pasha's cavalry could not charge uphill through forest. His infantry could not form the disciplined lines that made them lethal on flat ground. His archers could not find targets who appeared, struck, and vanished into terrain they knew like their own hands. Every Ottoman tactic assumed space to maneuver, room to deploy, time to reorganize. Skanderbeg gave them none of these things. By mid-afternoon, the Ottoman army broke. Not an orderly retreat, a rout. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. Officers abandoned their units. Ali Pasha himself barely escaped. His personal guard cut down around him as he fled north toward Ottoman territory. Historians still debate whether the casualty figures are exaggerated. Albanian chronicles claim 8,000 Ottomans killed. Ottoman sources acknowledge significant losses without providing numbers. What is certain is that equipment captured that day, armour, weapons, horses, gold, would supply the Albanian resistance for years. The Sultan received news of the defeat with characteristic restraint. He executed no one. He issued no furious proclamations. He simply began assembling another army. Larger this time, more experienced commanders, clearer orders. Skanderbeg used the breathing room to solidify his alliance. The victory at Torviol had accomplished what no speech could. It had proven that the Ottomans could be beaten. Lords who had hesitated now pledged troops. Villages that had hidden their young men now sent them to Kruja for training. The League of Leisure, fragile as spider silk in March, began to harden into something stronger. But the victory brought problems too. Success attracts attention. The Hungarians, still smarting from their own conflicts with the Ottomans, sent envoys proposing a grand alliance, a new crusade that would drive the Turks from Europe entirely. The Venetians, whose commercial interest in the Adriatic depended on neither side becoming too powerful, began calculating how they could profit from Albanian resistance without committing to it. The Pope himself sent letters praising Skanderbeg as a champion of Christendom. Everyone wanted something from him. No one offered anything concrete, and the Ottomans were coming again, always coming. That was the fundamental asymmetry Skanderbeg understood better than anyone. He had to win every battle. They only had to win once. The second invasion arrived in September. 30,000 men this time. A different commander, different tactics, the same objective. Skanderbeg met them at Ottonetta. The result was the same. The third invasion came the following spring, 40,000. Same result. Each victory carved his legend deeper into European consciousness. Each victory made the Sultan more determined to destroy him personally. Each victory brought him closer to an end he could already see coming. Not defeat in battle, but exhaustion, attrition, the slow grinding away of everything he had built. He was winning. And winning was killing him. The double-headed eagle flew over Kruja for 3 years before the Sultan decided to handle the problem personally. In those 3 years, Skanderbeg had defeated 6 Ottoman expeditions, 6 armies sent to crush him, 6 commanders who returned to Edirne in disgrace or did not return at all. The pattern had become almost routine. Ottoman forces would enter Albanian territory. Skanderbeg would refuse pitched battle. The mountains would swallow the invaders piece by piece until retreat became the only option. Europe watched in astonishment. This was not supposed to happen. Small nations did not defy the Ottoman Empire. Rebel generals did not defeat professional armies outnumbered 3-1. The natural order of the 15th century, Ottoman expansion, Christian retreat, seemed to have found an exception in these impossible mountains and this impossible man. The Pope called him Athleta Christi, champion of Christ. Hungarian envoys compared him to their own John Hunyadi. Venetian merchants, always practical, began calculating whether Albanian independence might benefit their shipping routes. Skanderbeg trusted none of them. He had spent too long in Ottoman courts, watching how empires manipulated their allies, to believe that European powers cared about Albanian freedom. They cared about buffer states. They cared about someone else bleeding against the Ottoman advance. They cared about Skanderbeg exactly as long as he was useful. He accepted their praise. He took their money when offered, which was rarely. He made no plans that depended on their help. Historians still debate whether this cynicism served him well or doomed his legacy. Without European support, Albania could resist but never truly threaten the Ottoman heartland. With European support, reliable support, the kind that came with armies rather than letters, he might have rolled the empire back entirely. But reliable support required trust, and trust required believing that Christian kingdoms would sacrifice their own soldiers for a country most Europeans could not find on a map. Skanderbeg believed in Albanian arms, nothing else. The alliance he'd built was fragile in ways that only he fully understood. The League of Leisure brought together lords who had feuded for generations. The Dukagjini hated the Arianiti. The Muzaka suspected everyone. Old grievances over land, marriages, and murders simmered beneath the surface of every council meeting. They had united against a common enemy, but common enemies have a way of becoming less threatening with distance. 3 years of victory had bred complacency. Lords who had pledged their swords at Leisure began questioning why they should send troops to defend territories far from their own lands. The mountain clans, fiercely independent by nature, chafed at taking orders from anyone, even a commander who had won every battle he fought. Skanderbeg held them together through personal force. His presence at a council could silence feuds that had lasted decades. His reputation made lords think twice before breaking their oaths. But he was one man, and Albania was a country of valleys, each valley its own world, each chief convinced his authority was sovereign. The cracks were hairline, invisible unless you knew where to look. But they were there, and Sultan Murad II was watching. Murad had spent 3 years dealing with other problems: Hungarian incursions, Anatolian revolts, a treaty with Venice that required delicate negotiation. He had trusted his generals to handle the Albanian rebellion, and his generals had failed him repeatedly. Now, in the summer of 1450, he decided that some tasks required a sultan's personal attention. The army he assembled was the largest the Balkans had seen in a generation. Contemporary sources vary on the exact numbers. Some claim 100,000, others suggest 60,000, but all agree on the essential point: this was not a punitive expedition. This was extermination. Murad brought siege engineers who had reduced Byzantine fortresses to rubble. He brought janissaries who had never known defeat. He brought artillery, primitive bombards that could shatter walls given enough time. He brought enough supplies to maintain a siege through winter if necessary. His objective was simple: Kruja. Take the fortress, kill everyone inside, and mount Skanderbeg's head on the walls as a message to any other vassal contemplating rebellion. Skanderbeg received intelligence of the approaching army weeks before it arrived. His scouts tracked its progress through Macedonia, counted its wagons, estimated its strength. The numbers were worse than he had feared. He could not meet this force in open battle, not even in the mountains. The sheer mass of Ottoman soldiers would overwhelm any ambush, absorb any casualties, keep coming until Albanian resistance drowned in blood. But he could not simply retreat, either. Kruja was more than a fortress. It was a symbol. The double-headed eagle flying over those walls represented everything the rebellion had achieved. If Kruja fell, the alliance would shatter, lords would make their separate pieces, the dream would die. Skanderbeg made his preparations with the cold precision of a man who has calculated his own death and found it acceptable if the price is right. He would not abandon Kruja. He would make the Sultan pay for every stone. Section 5, 850 words. Running total, 461 10,000. Sections remaining, 7. Target average for remaining sections, 848 words. Section 6. Victory becomes a target. The Ottoman army reached the plain below Kruja in May 1450. From the fortress walls, defenders watched the horizon darken with men, columns of infantry stretching back for miles, cavalry units wheeling into position, the glint of artillery being hauled forward on massive wagons. The sound reached them before the sight, the drum of marching feet, the creak of armour, the low rumble of an empire's anger given physical form. Sultan Murad established his command tent on a hill overlooking the fortress. He wanted Skanderbeg to see him there, wanted the traitor to understand that this was personal, that the man he had betrayed had come to collect the debt in person. The siege began with artillery. Ottoman bombards hurled stone balls against Kruja's walls, the impacts shaking the fortress to its foundations. Dust filled the air. Men covered their ears against the thunder. At night, the bombardment continued by torchlight, denying the defenders sleep, grinding down their nerves hour by hour. Skanderbeg was not inside the walls. This was the key to his strategy, the element that Ottoman intelligence had somehow missed. He had left a garrison of 1,500 men inside Kruja, under the command of his nephew, with orders to hold at any cost. But he himself was in the mountains with the mobile force, the cavalry and light infantry who could not defend walls, but could make an attacker's life miserable. While Murad's army focused on the fortress, Skanderbeg struck their supply lines. Ottoman logistics depended on a constant flow of food, ammunition, and reinforcements from Macedonia. The roads through the mountains were narrow, predictable, vulnerable. Albanian raiders appeared without warning, killing guards, burning wagons, vanishing before pursuit could be organised. A convoy that should have taken 3 days began taking 3 weeks. Soldiers who expected regular meals began going hungry. Historians still debate whether Skanderbeg intended to break the siege through attrition, or simply delay until winter forced a retreat. What is certain is that the siege stretched through summer and into autumn, and still Kruja held. The walls cracked, but did not fall. The garrison died at their posts but did not surrender. Every assault the Ottomans attempted was thrown back with losses that accumulated into catastrophe. The turning point came in late October. A major supply convoy, food and powder for the bombards, was ambushed in a mountain pass. The entire shipment was destroyed. 2,000 Ottoman soldiers died trying to protect it. Murad faced a choice. He could continue the siege through winter, watching his army starve in the Albanian mountains while Skanderbeg picked them apart. Or he could retreat, preserve his forces, and try again another year. He chose retreat. But not before one final gesture. Ottoman soldiers burned every village within 10 miles of Kruja, every farm, every orchard, every shepherd's hut. The smoke rose for days, visible from the fortress walls, a promise that even in defeat the Sultan could inflict suffering. The message was clear: you may have won this battle, but your people will pay for your defiance. The Albanian defenders watched their homeland burn. They did not surrender. Murad withdrew in November, his army reduced by 1/3 from its original strength. He returned to Edirne, humiliated for the second time by the same enemy, his reputation as an invincible conqueror permanently stained. He would not live to try again. The effort of the campaign, combined with other stresses, broke something in him. He died the following year, reportedly still obsessed with the Albanian who had escaped him. but his death brought no relief. Murad's son, Mehmed II, was 20 years old and already dreaming of conquests that would dwarf anything his father had achieved. He had plans for Constantinople, for the Balkans, for an empire that would stretch from the Danube to the Euphrates, and he had inherited something else from his dying father, a personal hatred of Skanderbeg that bordered on obsession. According to Ottoman court records, Murad's last instructions to his son included a specific command: finish what I started, destroy the Albanian, erase him from history. Mehmed accepted the charge. He was patient. He had Constantinople to capture first, a Byzantine empire to destroy, a name to make for himself, but he never forgot, never stopped planning, and here's where it gets worse. The victory at Kruja had made Skanderbeg a legend throughout Europe. Knights from Hungary and Germany wrote asking to serve under him. The Pope proposed a great crusade with Skanderbeg as its military commander. Venice offered alliance treaties that would have brought golden soldiers to Albanian shores. Every offer came with strings, every ally wanted something, and every year of fame made the target on Skanderbeg's back larger, brighter, more impossible to escape. He had proven that the Ottomans could be beaten. Now he would have to prove it again, and again, forever. Section 6, 851 words, running total 4912 to 10,000, sections remaining 6, target average for remaining sections, 848 words. Section 7, the siege that broke armies. The smell of smoke reached the camp before the messenger did. Spring, 460 Skanderbeg stood on a ridge overlooking the valley approaches, watching yet another Ottoman army snake through the passes below. This one was commanded by Balaban Pasha, a general who had studied every previous campaign, who had orders from Sultan Mehmed to succeed where all others had failed, who brought with him 80,000 men and enough artillery to reduce Kruja to gravel. 22 years had passed since the rebellion began. 22 years of continuous warfare. Skanderbeg was 60 years old now, his beard grey, his body carrying wounds from a dozen battles that had never properly healed. The sword arm that had once moved like lightning now ached in cold weather. The eyes that had spotted ambush opportunities at a glance now strained to see distant formations clearly. But the mind remained. The tactical genius that had broken Ottoman armies remained. He had perhaps 15,000 men under his command, the accumulated strength of a quarter-century of resistance, lords and mountain fighters and volunteers from across Europe who had come to serve under the famous Albanian. It was the largest force he had ever led. It was still outnumbered more than 5-1. Kruja could not withstand another direct siege. The walls, repaired after Murad's bombardment, had cracked again during subsequent Ottoman attacks. The garrison was exhausted. The supplies were low. A conventional defence would end in massacre, so Skanderbeg abandoned convention. He split his army into 3 divisions. One remained near Kruj as bait, visible enough to keep Ottoman attention fixed on the fortress. The second moved into the mountains east of the Ottoman line of march, disappearing into terrain so rugged that pursuit was impossible. The third, commanded by Skanderbeg personally, circled west through passes that no foreign army had ever discovered. Balaban Pasha saw the defenders near Kruja and assumed victory was inevitable. His scouts reported no significant Albanian forces elsewhere. His intelligence, based on captured prisoners and local informants who had been bribed or tortured, suggested that Skanderbeg's army was concentrated for a last stand at the fortress. The intelligence was wrong. It was always wrong. 22 years and the Ottomans still had not learned that Albanian mountains kept secrets like they kept snow, hidden in places no outsider could reach. The first attack came at dawn, 3 days into the siege. Ottoman soldiers woke to screaming. Their supply camp, positioned a mile behind the main force guarded by 2,000 men, was burning. Albanian cavalry had swept down from the western mountains, slaughtering sentries before the alarm could be raised, putting everything that could burn to the torch. When the camp commander tried to organise resistance, he found himself facing Skanderbeg personally. The commander died with his sword half drawn. His guards died around him. The supplies, food, powder, medical supplies, gold for paying troops, became ash and smoke. Balaban Pasha wheeled his army to pursue. The Albanians vanished into the mountains. The pursuit found nothing but empty trails and occasional arrows from unseen positions. 3 days later, the Eastern Division struck. A different target, The Ottoman rearguard this time, the units protecting the army's line of retreat. The attack was brief, brutal, and perfectly timed. It killed hundreds and disappeared before reinforcements could arrive. The pattern continued for weeks. Every time the Ottomans concentrated their forces, the Albanians attacked somewhere else. Every time they dispersed to cover more ground, they became vulnerable to ambush. The mountain terrain, familiar to Skanderbeg, hostile to the invaders, turned every tactical decision into a trap. Historians still debate whether Balaban Pasha could have adapted. Some argue that aggressive pursuit into the mountains might have forced a decisive battle. Others point out that every Ottoman commander who had pursued Skanderbeg into the high country had lost his army to ambush and starvation. The terrain itself was the Albanians' greatest weapon. What is certain is that by midsummer, Balaban's army was disintegrating, not through any single defeat, through the slow accumulation of casualties, the constant fear of unseen enemies, the grinding exhaustion of fighting a war without front lines. Men deserted in the night. Officers reported that their troops refused orders to advance. The siege of Kruja continued in name, but the besiegers were now the besieged, trapped in hostile territory, bleeding from 1,000 cuts. In August, Balaban Pasha ordered a general assault on Kruja. It was an act of desperation, a gamble that taking the fortress might salvage something from the catastrophe. Ottoman infantry charged the walls with ladders and siege towers, driven forward by officers who knew that failure meant execution. The assault failed. The garrison held. Balaban Pasha died in the fighting, struck by an arrow, according to Albanian sources, though Ottoman records dispute this. The army retreated. 40,000 fewer than had arrived. The battle is over, the real tragedy is just beginning. Section 7, 850 words, running total 5762, 10,000. Sections remaining 5. Target average for remaining sections 848 words. Section 8, the Sultan's obsession. While the Spartans waited on the ridge, the enemy was already moving through the passes. Mehmed II received news of Balaban's defeat in Constantinople. He did not rage, he did not execute messengers. He sat in silence for a long moment, then spoke 3 words that his scribes recorded for posterity: "I will go." The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, conqueror of Constantinople, master of the greatest military machine in the world, had decided to handle Skanderbeg personally. The same decision his father had made 16 years earlier. The same obsession, inherited like a disease. Mehmed's court attempted to dissuade him. The Sultan had responsibilities, an empire to govern, frontiers to defend, campaigns being planned against Venice and Hungary, and the remnants of Byzantine resistance. To risk the imperial person against a mountain rebel, however troublesome, seemed beneath the dignity of a world conqueror. Mehmed dismissed these concerns. He understood something his advisors did not. Skanderbeg was not merely a military problem, he was a symbol. As long as he lived, as long as that double-headed eagle flew over Kruja, every vassal and every subject knew that Ottoman power had limits. That resistance was possible, that the empire could be defied, symbols had to be destroyed. That was what empires did. The army Mehmed assembled in 1467 was unprecedented. 200,000 men by some accounts, though historians still debate whether such numbers are exaggerated. Regardless of the exact figure, it was the largest Ottoman force ever directed against a single enemy. Artillery sufficient to reduce any fortress in Europe. Engineers who had broken the walls of Constantinople itself. Supplies stockpiled for a campaign that would last until victory, no matter how long that took. Skanderbeg's response to this overwhelming force revealed the depth of his desperation and his genius. He did not even attempt to defend Kruja directly. The fortress that had become the symbol of Albanian resistance was evacuated, its garrison dispersed into the mountains. When Mehmed's vanguard reached the walls, they found them unmanned. The double-headed eagle had been taken down, folded, carried into hiding by men who would die before surrendering it. The Sultan occupied an empty prize. His artillery bombarded walls that no one defended. His troops searched for an enemy that refused to exist in any place where overwhelming force could be applied. Mehmed understood the trap but could not escape it. To leave Albania without destroying Skanderbeg would be an even greater humiliation than his father had suffered. To stay meant watching his vast army drain away through attrition, disease, and the endless small attacks that came from everywhere and nowhere. He chose to stay. He chose to hunt. The campaigns of 1467 and 1468 were nightmares for both sides. Ottoman columns pushed into valleys where no Ottoman had ever marched, seeking the hidden bases where Skanderbeg's forces gathered and dispersed. They found villages burned in advance of their arrival, wells poisoned, crops destroyed. They found ambushes in passes that looked safe. They found sickness spreading through camps that lacked clean water. Historians still debate whether Skanderbeg considered surrender during this period. The constant fighting had reduced Albanian forces to perhaps 5,000 effective soldiers. The harvest had failed for 2 consecutive years, not from weather but from the impossibility of farming while 200,000 enemy soldiers roamed the countryside. Starvation loomed, but surrender meant death, not just for Skanderbeg, for every lord who had supported him, every family that had sheltered his soldiers, every village that had raised the double-headed eagle. Ottoman vengeance was not symbolic, it was total, so they fought on, skeleton forces against an empire, ghosts against an army that could not find them, could not catch them, could not force them to stand and be destroyed. Mehmed's patience, legendary among Ottoman sultans, finally cracked in August 1468. He had been in Albania for over a year. His army had lost tens of thousands to disease and attrition. His treasury was hemorrhaging gold. His other frontiers were weakening as resources poured into this Albanian black hole. He withdrew. Not in defeat. Officially, he had pacified the region. The fortresses were in Ottoman hands, the fields were burned, the population was decimated, but Skanderbeg still lived. The symbol remained unbroken. Mehmed returned to Constantinople and began planning his next invasion. He would try again, and again, as many times as necessary. The obsession that had killed his father had now consumed him entirely. What he did not know, what his spies had not discovered, was that Skanderbeg was already dying. Not from Ottoman swords, not from assassination, from something no army could fight. The man who had humiliated 2 sultans was being killed by a fever, and all his victories were about to become meaningless. Section 8, 829 words. Running total, 6591 to 10,000 Ost. Sections remaining, 4. Target average for remaining sections, 852 words. Section 9. Betrayal from within. That decision would haunt him before sunrise. The winter of 1467 had broken something in the alliance, not the Ottoman armies. Those could be defeated, had been defeated, would be defeated again. What broke was trust. Leka Dukakjini was the first to waver. His lands in the northern highlands had been ravaged by Ottoman reprisals. Villages burned, livestock slaughtered, families scattered into the mountains. He had spent 20 years fighting for Skanderbeg's cause, and his reward was ash. The messengers he sent to Venice returned with sympathy but no soldiers. The appeals to the Pope produced blessings but no gold. One night, an Ottoman envoy reached his camp under a flag of truce. The terms were simple: abandon Skanderbeg, recognise Ottoman suzerainty, and the northern highlands would be spared further devastation. Dukakjini would retain his titles, his lands, his authority. He would simply exchange one overlord for another. Historians still debate whether Dukakjini actually considered betrayal or whether this was a feint, a way to buy time while Skanderbeg's forces regrouped. What is certain is that word of the negotiation reached other Albanian lords, and the effect was corrosive. If Dukakjini could negotiate, why couldn't they? If the north could make its separate peace, why should the south continue bleeding? The alliance had always been a fragile thing, held together by victory and the personal authority of one man. Now, both were failing. Skanderbeg convened an emergency council in December 1467. The meeting, held in a mountain village far from any fortress the Ottomans might target, gathered every lord who still answered his call. The count was depressing. Fewer than half of the original signatories to the League of Leisure. The others had died, or made their peace with the Ottomans, or simply stopped coming to councils that seemed increasingly pointless. The arguments lasted 3 days. Dukakjini defended himself against accusations of treason. The Arianiti demanded to know why their lands should burn while the Kastrioti heartland remained relatively untouched. Ancient feuds, suppressed for 2 decades, erupted with fresh venom. At one point, 2 lords drew swords and had to be physically separated. Skanderbeg listened. He did not rage. He did not threaten. He sat in silence as the alliance he had built fell apart around him, as men who had sworn blood oaths called each other cowards and traitors. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. According to the chronicle that records the council, he said only this: "I will not abandon you, you may abandon yourselves." The words struck harder than any threat. The lords who had been shouting fell silent. For a moment, something of the old unity flickered. Shame, perhaps, or the memory of what they had accomplished together, but shame fades, and the Ottomans were still coming. The council ended without resolution. No lord openly defected, but no lord committed fresh troops either. The alliance existed on paper. In practice, Skanderbeg was increasingly alone. The defections began in spring 1468. Not dramatic betrayals, quiet surrenders. Lords who simply stopped responding to messages. Villages that raised the Ottoman banner rather than face another raiding season. Officials who discovered that their loyalty could be purchased with gold and guarantees. Each defection weakened the defence. Each weakness invited more Ottoman pressure. Each pressure created more incentive to defect. The cycle was self-reinforcing, a death spiral that no tactical genius could arrest. Skanderbeg responded the only way he knew, with war. He launched raids into Ottoman-held territory, seeking victories that might restore confidence, remind his wavering allies why they had followed him in the first place. The raid succeeded. They always succeeded, but success no longer mattered. His body was failing. The fever that had plagued him intermittently for years returned with new ferocity in the autumn of 1467. He ignored it, as he had ignored every wound, every exhaustion, every signal that flesh and blood had limits. There was too much to do, too many enemies, too few allies. By December, he could no longer ride. The man who had spent 25 years in the saddle, who had crossed the Albanian highlands more times than any map could record, was confined to a bed in the coastal town of Lezhë. His wife Donica sat beside him. His son Gjergj, named for the father who had sold him to the Ottomans half a century before, stood at the door. Around the town, the remnants of the Albanian army waited for orders that their commander could no longer give. The fever spiked on January 17, 1468. Skanderbeg, 62 years old, died in the night. No Ottoman soldier killed him, no assassin's blade, no treachery by his remaining allies. Just a fever, burning through a body that had been fighting for 25 years without rest. The news spread faster than any messenger could ride. By dawn, every Ottoman garrison knew. By week's end, Sultan Mehmed was planning his final invasion. The man who had held back an empire was gone. The empire was coming to collect. Section 9, 873 words. Running total, 7,464, 10,000. Sections remaining 3. Target average for remaining sections, 845 words. Section 10. The price of being indispensable victory was declared at noon. The dying didn't stop until nightfall. The immediate aftermath of Skanderbeg's death unfolded with the predictability of tragedy. His son Gjergj, barely 20 years old, attempted to hold the alliance together. He had his father's name, his father's title, even something of his father's bearing. What he lacked was 25 years of victories, 25 years of reputation, 25 years of lords watching Skanderbeg perform the impossible until impossibility seemed routine. Gjergj was not his father, no one could be. The League of Lezhë met one final time in February 1468. The gathering was poorly attended. Several major lords did not bother sending representatives. Those who came argued about succession, about strategy, about whether continuing resistance was even possible. The arguments had a performative quality, as if everyone present knew the conclusion but needed to observe the forms before reaching it. Historians still debate whether unified Albanian resistance could have survived Skanderbeg's death under different circumstances. Perhaps if Gjergj had been older, more experienced, blessed with early victories to establish his own reputation. Perhaps if Venice or the Pope had finally delivered the material support they had promised for decades. Perhaps if the Ottoman Empire had been distracted by other threats. None of these conditions obtained. The alliance fractured within months. Duke Gjergj made his separate peace with the Ottomans in spring 1468. His terms were better than expected. The Sultan wanted quick submission, not prolonged negotiation. Other lords followed, the Arianiti, the Thopia. One by one, the families that had sworn to fight until death discovered that death had terms. The holdouts were punished accordingly. Villages that continued resisting were razed. Leaders who refused to submit were executed. Their heads displayed on pikes outside Ottoman fortresses as instruction to their neighbours. The method was efficient, systematic, utterly without passion, the bureaucratic pacification of a troublesome province. Gjergj Kastrioti fled to Italy with his mother and a handful of loyal retainers. They settled in the Kingdom of Naples, where Albanian refugees had already established communities. Gjergj spent the rest of his life petitioning European courts for support to reclaim his homeland. The petitions were politely received. None resulted in action. The irony was acute. For 25 years, Skanderbeg had been Europe's shield against Ottoman expansion, the rebel who pinned down armies that might otherwise have pushed into Hungary, into Italy, into the heart of Christendom. European powers had praised him, honoured him, called him champion of Christ and defender of the faith. They had not defended him. When he needed soldiers, they sent letters. When he needed gold, they sent prayers. When he needed allies who would bleed alongside him, they sent ambassadors with flowery speeches and empty promises. The calculation was cold but understandable. As long as Skanderbeg lived, he served European interests by absorbing Ottoman military resources. Dead Albanians were cheaper than committed troops. A bleeding buffer state was more useful than a stable ally. Skanderbeg had understood this from the beginning. He had built his entire strategy around the assumption that he would fight alone. But understanding a betrayal does not lessen its sting. The fortresses fell one by one through 1478 and 1479. Kruja, the symbol, the heart. The fortress that had broken 2 sultans surrendered after a siege of more than a year. The garrison that finally opened the gates was starving, reduced to eating leather and rats. They had held longer than anyone could reasonably expect. It was not enough. Ottoman administrators moved into the Albanian highlands with the systematic efficiency of an empire that had absorbed 100 conquered provinces. They imposed new taxes, new laws, new officials. They converted churches to mosques. They enrolled Albanian boys in the Devsham system, the same system that had taken Skanderbeg 70 years before. The cycle continued. New boys would be raised as janissaries, trained to serve the Sultan, taught to forget their language and their father's faith. Some would serve loyally, others might remember. The double-headed eagle disappeared from Albanian fortresses. The flag that should not have flown was folded away, hidden in exile, preserved by refugees who carried it across the Adriatic to Italy and beyond. It would fly again, but not for 400 years. Skanderbeg had won every battle and lost the war. The man who had humiliated 2 sultans left a country that could not survive without him. His very indispensability had been his legacy's doom. Section 10, 746 words. Running total, 8,210, 10,000. Sections remaining, 2. Target average for remaining sections, 695 words. Section 11, the body fails, what the spirit cannot. The smell of sickness filled the room. Sweat and fever and something deeper. The sour undertone of a body consuming itself. The windows had been shuttered against the January cold, and the air was thick with smoke from braziers that could not warm what was already dying. Skanderbeg lay on a bed in leisure, in a stone house overlooking the Adriatic. The sea was invisible in the winter darkness, but he could hear it. Waves against the shore, the eternal rhythm that had accompanied every coastal campaign, every desperate landing, every retreat by water when the mountains became too dangerous. He had not spoken in 2 days. The fever had stripped away words, leaving only laboured breathing and occasional movements that might have been attempts to rise. His wife Donica sat beside him, holding a hand that had once gripped swords and now lay slack against the blankets. Around the room gathered the remnants of his command, lords who had not yet defected, officers who had served since the beginning, priests who murmured prayers in Albanian and Latin, as if uncertain which language God might prefer. They watched their commander die, and knew they were watching their cause die with him. Historians still debate whether Skanderbeg retained consciousness in his final hours. Some accounts describe lucid moments, final instructions, words of encouragement to his son. Others suggest he passed from fever into delirium into silence, never fully aware that the end had come. What is certain is that his body bore the map of his wars. The physician who attended him catalogued wounds old and new. Sword cuts scarred silver on his arms, an arrow wound in his shoulder that had never properly healed, the marks of at least 3 falls from horses. 25 years of combat had written themselves on his flesh in a text that would not survive him. The fever itself was unremarkable. Perhaps malaria contracted in the coastal campaigns, perhaps simple exhaustion, a system that had run past every reasonable limit finally collapsing. Perhaps something else entirely. The sources do not agree, and medieval medicine could not distinguish between a dozen possibilities that shared the same symptoms. It did not matter. What mattered was that the greatest general of his age was being killed by something invisible, something that could not be fought or outmaneuvered or ambushed in a mountain pass. The body had limits that the spirit refused to acknowledge. The final night was quiet. No enemy attacked, no urgent messages arrived demanding decisions, just the sound of breathing growing shallower and the crackle of fires that could not keep the cold at bay. He died sometime before dawn on January 17th, 1468. The exact hour is unrecorded. Donnica's wail pierced the silence. The sound carried through the house, into the courtyard, through the streets of leisure where soldiers huddled against the cold. They knew what it meant before any messenger reached them. They had been waiting for it, dreading it, knowing it was coming for months. The news spread in expanding circles. By morning, it had reached the Ottoman garrisons that ringed Albanian territory. By week's end, messengers were riding toward Constantinople with reports that would make Sultan Mehmed smile for the first time in years. By month's end, all of Europe knew that the man who had held back the tide was gone. The funeral was modest by the standards of his fame. There was no great cathedral, no procession of European dignitaries, no monument befitting a champion of Christ. There was a church in leisure, a grave dug in frozen ground, prayers spoken over a body wrapped in a simple shroud. The Albanian lords who attended did not weep. They had spent too many years learning that grief was a luxury soldiers could not afford. They stood in silence, calculating how long they had before the Ottomans arrived, whether their families could reach Venice in time, which of their neighbours might be persuaded to make a common stand. The calculations led nowhere. There was no common stand. There was only the grave, and the church, and the certain knowledge that everything they had built was about to be destroyed. Gjergj Kastrioti, the son who would never fill his father's place, threw a handful of dirt onto the grave. The sound it made, cold earth striking cold earth, seemed to echo longer than it should. The gathering dispersed before nightfall. Everyone had preparations to make. Behind them, unmarked and already being forgotten, lay the body of the man who had made Sultans fear. Section 11, 767 words, running total 8977 to 10,000, sections remaining. 1. Target average for remaining sections, 1/23 words. Section 12, the bones they fought over the church in Leisure, stood for 11 years after Skanderbeg's burial. Not untouched, Ottoman soldiers had raided it repeatedly, looking for treasure that did not exist, stripping anything of value that the refugees had left behind. But the building remained, the grave remained, the bones beneath the earth remained. In 1479, Leisure finally fell to Ottoman control. Sultan Mehmed, whose father had died obsessed with Skanderbeg, whose own campaigns against Albania had cost more blood and treasure than any other conquest, ordered something unprecedented. They dug up the body. Ottoman soldiers opened the grave on a spring morning, working with shovels and picks while their officers supervised. What they found was unremarkable. Bones, cloth fragments, the remnants of a man who had been dead for over a decade. There was no gold buried with him, no weapons, no treasures. Skanderbeg had died as he had lived, without luxury, but the bones themselves were treasure. The soldiers divided them. Each man took a piece, a finger bone, a rib, a fragment of skull. They carried these relics away and had them set in silver, in gold, in amulets worn around the neck or sewn into clothing. Ottoman warriors who had never faced Skanderbeg in battle began wearing pieces of him into their own fights, believing that his power might transfer through contact with his remains. Historians still debate whether this desecration was ordered by Mehmed or simply tolerated by local commanders. What is certain is that it happened, and that its implications were profound. The Ottomans, who had spent 25 years failing to destroy Skanderbeg, ended up venerating him. The enemy they could not defeat in life became a talisman in death. The church was demolished. The grave was emptied. Within a generation, no one could identify the exact spot where the champion of Christ had been buried. His family fared better, though not by much. Gjergj Kastrioti and his mother Donica settled in the Kingdom of Naples, joining the Albanian diaspora that had been building since the Ottoman conquest began. They lived on pensions provided by Italian nobles who remembered Skanderbeg's fame, though the pensions were always smaller than promised and always arrived late. John spent years attempting to organise a return, a reconquest of Albania with European backing. The project never advanced beyond planning stages. European powers had other concerns. The buffer state was gone, new strategies were required. Albania became a footnote in Ottoman administration, its resistance erased from the historical record that conquerors write. The double-headed eagle survived in exile. Albanian communities in Italy preserved it, passed it down through generations, kept it ready for a return that their grandchildren and great-grandchildren would never see. It became a symbol of something lost rather than something defended. 400 years would pass before Albania regained independence. 400 years of Ottoman rule, of conversion and assimilation, and the slow forgetting that empires impose on conquered peoples. When independence finally came, in 1912, the men who declared it reached back across the centuries and claimed Skanderbeg as their founder, the original defender, the proof that Albanians had once been free. They built statues, they put his face on currency, they taught school children that he was the father of the nation, the hero who had held back the darkness. The legend grew larger than the man had ever been, cleaned of ambiguity, purified of the moral compromises that any 25-year war demands. History remembers the victories, it forgot the price. It forgot the Albanian villages burned to ash while European powers sent letters of support. It forgot the boys taken in the Devshirme, raised as janissaries, turned against their own blood. It forgot the lords who defected, the alliances that crumbled, the cynical calculation that kept Skanderbeg fighting alone because his death would cost Europe nothing. It forgot that the system survived while the man did not. The Ottoman Empire endured for another 4.5 centuries after Skanderbeg's death. It conquered new territories, absorbed new peoples, became one of the great powers of the early modern world. The Albanian resistance was a wound, but wounds heal. The empire adapted. The empire continued. Skanderbeg died in a bed in Lezhë, killed by a fever, surrounded by allies who were already calculating their surrenders. The man who had never lost a battle lost the only war that mattered. The war against time, against mortality, against the simple fact that individuals die and systems endure. They dug up his bones and wore them as jewellery. They demolished his grave and forgot its location. They erased his country from the map for 4 centuries, and still, somehow, his name survived. Still, the double-headed eagle flew in exile in memory, in the stubborn refusal of conquered peoples to forget what freedom once felt like. The empire endured. The man did not, but empires end, and names sometimes outlast them.